Hey, Faith Family, I hope you guys are doing well. So glad to be back with you guys as we continue in our current series, Joshua, Living a Life of Faithfulness in Hard Times. As Pastor David preached out of Joshua chapter 9 about the deceptive enemy he faced, I can't help but think of Elisha and the kindness and mercy he showed to the Aramean army in 2 Kings chapter 6. If this passage sounds a little familiar to you, it's because it is. Pastor Jason used the verses before this passage last week to show us Elisha's faith during this mighty battle compared to Joshua's faith in the Battle of Jericho. And in both cases, God came through miraculously. But the story doesn't end there. Even though God had delivered their enemies into their hands, Elisha still had a choice in how he reacted, just as Joshua did. These men's responses may surprise you, and they will certainly challenge you. So, as we learned last week from Pastor Jason, the Israelites won a great victory over the Arameans. The Arameans found themselves in captivity and at the mercy of Elisha and the Israelites. Elisha prayed that they would be blinded. A type of blindness fell over them, leading them to a position of complete vulnerability. But then Elisha does something no one is expecting. They expected an onslaught of judgment, but instead Elisha gave them a feast of grace. The way that Elisha responded in this situation can teach us so much. And the first lesson that we can learn from this passage is not to take our enemy too seriously. We can see how easily God defeated this enemy. And on top of that, we can see that the enemy here is not Satan and his angels, but just another group of humans that aren't following God. It would be easier to live in this sinful world full of sinful people if we could remember this truth. People are not really our enemy. Maybe we see our so-called enemies and give them too much credit, or we don't give God enough credit to deliver us from our enemies. The truth is, God told us that we will have enemies in this world. People who cause us grief and oppose us, even people in our family and church that would seek to hurt us. But if we could learn to see them the way that Jesus sees them, we would know that they are not indeed our enemy. They are hurting people who hurt people. They are unloved people who don't know how to love. Maybe if we saw them the way that Jesus saw them, we could learn to love them anyway. The second lesson that we can all learn is about spiritual sight. Much has been made about physical blindness in this story, but there's even more to learn about the spiritual blindness. So picture this: Elisha leads the Aramean army right into the arms of the king of Israel. Then the king asked Elisha if he should put the army to death. Now, if this was me, I certainly would have, because I would have been working in a mindset of fear and anger, but Elisha was neither fearful nor angry. Elisha wasn't scared when he stood on the Mount of Dothan and faced the Aramean army by himself, and he wasn't angry even as they stood in captivity. You see, Elisha had a spiritual sight that extended beyond what most people could see. Elisha could see the bigger picture. He could see a sovereign God who had all things under his control. And because of this, he chose to show grace and mercy. And it worked out. We see that after Elisha threw a feast and released the Aramean army, they did not return to raid the Israelites. This same spiritual blindness was present when Jesus came. Everybody had a vision of who the Messiah was supposed to be, a ruling, conquering king. So when Jesus came along washing people's feet and teaching a message of love and forgiveness, so many people missed it because of their spiritual blindness. The third lesson we can learn is about grace. It's very ironic that Elisha, the man that the Arameans hated, who was their public enemy number one, actually ended up being one of their greatest allies. This man who had been the instrument of their downfall would also be the instrument of their salvation. The Aramean army that had been ravaging Israel was led into the lion's den, Samaria, and the king was excited to exact his revenge on them for their crimes against Israel. But Elisha stops them from killing them and even feeds them so much food and drink that it's considered a feast. If Elijah had slain all these Aramean men, the war would have only intensified. But this amazing act of clemency ends the war. Don't miss this, you guys. This is the gospel. In this story, we often want to place ourselves in Elisha's shoes or even the Israelite army, but in reality, we are more like the Aramean army. Before we were believers, we made war with God. We abused His glory. We made Him our enemy, and by every standard that exists in heaven and earth, we deserve to die, but instead, we were given a feast. Just like Elisha, Jesus took His enemies and He captured their hearts. Instead of judgment, He gave them grace. Instead of death and destruction, He gave them eternal life in the presence of God. This is amazing grace, and all that the Lord wants in return is for us to offer the same grace to others. This is the ultimate victory. And the ultimate victory is not to destroy your enemies, but to turn your enemies into friends. And that's what Elisha did with these soldiers and what Jesus does with us. So what about you? How do you treat your enemies? Who are some people you know that might even be enemies to you, but you are holding out on forgiveness and grace? What do you think they might do if you showed them love and grace? What steps are you taking to live in peace with all men? Life is always full of those who are against us. So how do we respond? With mercy or destruction?